Hello, everyone. We are going to go through today chapter 2, which is going to take us off into a different direction for the time being. For those of you that have had Management 360 with me, uh, and I talked about it on video number 1, chapter number 1, uh, a handout that I give you called Master Strategy Tools. I don't know how I come up with the names of my materials, but there they are, and I shouldn't say they're mine. They're a collection of information out there. So let's just dive right in so we can hopefully get through it at a relatively quick pace. All right, so chapter 2 talks about strategy formulation, the strategy execution process, and those types of things. And almost immediately we talk about creating a mission and vision. And again, I'm just going to read off these learning objectives. Understand why it is critical for the company managers to have a clear vision of where a company needs to head and why it needs to head there. Explain the importance of setting both strategic and financial objectives. 3, explain the strategic initiative taken at various organizational levels must be tightly coordinated to achieve company-wide performance targets. Um, I don't like that word tightly coordinated. It can be a loaded word, but whatever. And 4, recognize what a company must do to achieve operating excellence and to execute its strategy proficiently. And talks a little bit about formulating a strategy. And they talk about setting a vision, setting objectives, crafting a strategy, um, implementing the strategy, and then evaluating and going back and adjusting if necessary. And that gets us into our next slide, which is developing a strategic vision, mission, and values. And then they get into what's often called an operating plan. Notice the term operating decisions there. So we're going to go over to that handout I told you about. If you go to D2L and you go over to content, and you go into Bruce's docs, there's only one there, and Master Strategy Tools. Go ahead and open that up to make sure I have the right version. Oops, sorry about that, guys. And what do we got here? Let's get rid of that one. Let's do that one. There we go. Okay. So as I mentioned on chapter 1, I have a really hard time when setting a mission and a vision is suggested in a textbook. Because what ends up happening is you have steps in it, and they, just as we saw earlier here, steps. Number 1, let me go there, develop a strategic vision, mission, and values. And I have a really hard time with doing that because of some of my experience as a business consultant. So one of the things that I noticed when I've gone in and usually meet with executive teams and we talk a little bit about this stuff, and I've taken part in many strategic plans across for-profits, nonprofits, so on and so forth. And we talk about developing a mission, a vision, and the value statements. Now, if you look at this document, let me try to expand it here a little bit. You'll notice I kind of try to put these tools in order. And there's a reason I'm putting these tools in this particular order. And actually, many of them don't necessarily matter what order they're in, but there's a reason why I put number 14 almost dead last. The reason is because all of these tools will help shape the strategy. It will help shape the mission statement and the vision statement and the value statements. The story I'd mentioned in chapter 1 is you have, I've sat across the table from a number of executives, one in particular, and I asked this question. At the time, I utilized value. Well, I always utilize value disciplines, but I asked, why do people buy this product? Are they buying it because they get the best customer service here, or relative to maybe features to cost, it's the right balance, so it would be customer intimacy, or they're trying to get the best product, or are they trying to get it at the lowest price? And when I asked this question, I went around a room with seven people. One of them was the founder and the CEO of the company. And everybody, it was like two per in the value discipline. So we're going to fly ahead here. And my apologies. There we go. We have our three value disciplines, which comes from the discipline of market leaders from Tracy and Wiersma, Michael Tracy and Fred Wiersma. They're a very well-known book, and they suggest that the companies, when they're trying to compete, can only do so on one of these dimensions. There's so few businesses that would actually have the resources to produce the best product at the lowest price and have the best customer service. Almost no company has that level of resources and finances and capacity to try to be all things to all people. So what they learned in their research is companies that were laser focused on one of these disciplines were far more likely to be successful um, than if they tried to focus on all of them. So in this board meeting that I had been in, I had asked this question, and again, I had to pick, well, people like they come here because they can get the best products or the highest end real estate or something. And then I had two others that talked about customer service and how there's no other place that gives as good a customer service, and we follow up afterwards and we try to stay in contact. And then I had a couple others say, yeah, but you can also get get pretty cheap, inexpensive, widgets here. And we went through all of them. And then finally at the very end, the CEO said, guys, we're customer intimacy. It says it in our mission statement. Now, I'm not a usually a jerk in meetings like that, but I could have been a jerk and said, well, obviously nobody here knows that. So the communication is ineffective in the organization if you don't understand that one of these has to be picked. And the CEO knew it the moment he said it. Or the moment he watched that unfold, he's like, "Oh, there's one of our issues there." Yes, your executives, your top managers are trying to be all things to all people. And when you're in a board meeting like that and you hear six seasoned executives, people that have been doing this for 25 years, and they all are saying something different, if you as a individual were a fly on the wall and you heard all six of these responses, you say, well, those are all good things, aren't they? Shouldn't we be trying to strive to do all of those? And the answer is no, absolutely not. You don't want to do that because you cannot be all things to all people. You have to choose a direction. Once you do that, you're saying almost as much of what you're not going to do is what you're going to do. Okay. You're not going to focus on trying to be all things to all people. You're not going to worry if you have a product leadership strategy, you're not going to get wrapped around the axle about price. Now, that's not to say you want to let costs soar and price yourself out of the market in whatever it is you're trying to achieve, but you're not going to get trying to cut every last penny in your expenses, and because that's not why people are buying whatever it is you're selling. They're buying it because they want the best product. So that's why these strategies are so important and to acknowledge. Normally in a semester class, I'll go through 20 or 30 different companies and ask them what is their value discipline. And one example we usually come up with is John Deere. And students get hung up. Usually the ones that, because we're in a farming community or in South Dakota, and when you mention that to guys that are farmers, who are the guys that are the people that buy the green machines? The John Deere implements and everything they have in their barn is or their shed is green. Most of them would say, well, because they're the best product. Now, they have good customer service, no doubt, but usually they're getting it because they feel it's a higher caliber product and they're going to pay for that. Now, I've had a couple students say, well, actually, I think it's customer service person. It doesn't matter. What we know for certain is that John Deere is not trying to compete in an operationally excellent manner, meaning they're the low cost producer. They're not a low cost company. So again, it's the strategy is as much what you're not going to do as what you're going to do. So when we get into these other strategies and examining this, that's what you need to keep in mind. So I like to envision this when you're looking at businesses and companies and you're trying to figure out which should be chosen here. You put your customer lens on and say, why do they buy this? Okay. And is there an underlying theme, one of these value disciplines that's there? And the one thing we don't want to do is to try to change that. Now, there are some companies that have no choice but to change their value discipline. I would say 90 out of 100 companies should never change their value discipline without acknowledging that everything's pretty much going to have to change. Because changing a value discipline, that's what occurs. You I think I used the example in chapter one is can you imagine if Walmart all of a sudden tried to have the best customer service of any large box retail store out there? Um, the billions and billions of dollars of resources that they would have to expend to redo everything within their operation would have to change. And it would be costly. And the real option is that they have no idea if they would be successful. Now, one of the issues comes up though is, well, what if they have to change? What if their current strategy is absolutely not working? Well, then are they going to have to do this? And sometimes we have producers, especially I would say manufacturers, that are producing products or services that are going extinct. There's times like that where you don't have a choice. You have to make a change to a different value discipline. There's just no other option. It's either change or die. So just keep in the back of your mind every time we're talking, every time you're watching or every time you're dealing in business, think value disciplines. Okay. What that's going to be huge. And that's the type of thing, especially if we're talking publicly traded companies, investors can smell that when all of a sudden a company that normally was a product leadership firm all of a sudden starts talking about customer intimacy or customer service or worse than that, they start talking about becoming the low cost producer, becoming operationally excellent. When investors hear that, that's like alarm bells. It's like, whoa, 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 whoa. What? Why are you changing your value discipline? That's a no go. Danger, Will Robinson. When none of you know what that has anything to do with. Okay, so let's get back to it. So the big issue that we're talking about here is trying to create a vision and a mission statement. We'll go through the textbook ways of doing this, but I want to go through all 14 or 15 of these notes. I've compiled these notes from not only my tools or my toolbox, but I've also gone ahead online to try to find open source, very inexpensive, or not inexpensive, open source materials that explain this stuff at a very quick rate without diving into too much minutia. So I would encourage every one of you, regardless, read through this document. It's about 60 pages. I'm going to go through it in here. If you, once you get done with this, take a half hour and read through it again. I would almost imagine after doing that, you would have a pretty good warm and fuzzy about what it is we're talking about. So in chapter one, we talked about the sort of reason for being. Every textbook out there, business textbook, is going to talk about a sustainable competitive advantage. In fact, just as a side note, let's jump over here. If you look, remember we're on slide 4. If you look at your textbook, it's in the title. Okay. The Essentials of Strategic Management, the Quest for a Competitive Advantage. It doesn't say the quest for profits. And they're not just pulling out profits because maybe that sounds greedy or something. It's because that's not the intent. The intent is how do you survive? Because this is kind of like a game. And the answer is you have to become competitive. You have to achieve a competitive advantage. So, well, isn't that a little fun one? Sorry. Okay, so we already talked about sustainable competitive advantage. That is the be all end all. That's what you're, in effect, that's what you're trying to achieve when you talk about strategic planning. And we got about 15 other tools. I will offer to you that the 11 and 12 and 13 are not, those are like, those are huge systems that companies adopt. The balanced scorecard, for example, can't think of one off the top of my head, but let's say the Mayo Clinic. The Mayo Clinic, huge healthcare system, might use a balanced scorecard method. And that means that all of the administrative work that's done at the Mayo Clinic follows the idea of a balanced scorecard. So they're looking at four different dimensions of business or of operating, and they're trying to make sure that those things are balanced because it's a balanced scorecard. Because if you focus on one way too much and you miss the other one, then well, you tip over. So, and I should say with the value disciplines, we're not saying if you're an operationally excellent firm that you can just throw customer service out the window. If you walked into Walmart and the employees started like spitting at you and swearing at you, that'd probably be a bad thing. We're not saying that, you know, this is at the sacrifice of completely of everything else. But, and I think I'll probably turn this into a test question. I have found when students use AI in Chat GPT, when they talk about value disciplines, especially for a specific company, almost every one of them lists a value discipline. Three of the value disciplines are examples for a company. That's not the point of it. So if I ask you for a value discipline, I'm not asking for three things. I'm asking for one thing. What's the one thing you're going to focus on? So, and it's either operational excellence or cost, product leadership, or customer intimacy, customer service. Okay, let's dive into this. So, all of these tools, I've kind of strategically placed them so they feed into each other. Um, to get to a larger scope with the intent by the time we get to 14 here, then once you're understanding of all this, that's when you can start looking at mission. That's when you can start looking at vision and values. Okay. So mission statements are purpose, vision statements where we want to go, and value statements is how are we going to get there? What are we going to do, or what are we not willing to do in order to achieve that, which are values. Um, Yeah, we better talk about this quick. So, one of the most read Harvard Business Review articles talks about strategic planning. And this article, in particular, this article has been rewritten a couple different times, but it talks about the big lie of strategic planning. And in it, uh, I believe it's Roger Martin talks about how managers, executives really actually don't like to do strategic planning in most businesses. And the reason they don't like to do strategic planning in most businesses is they would argue things change so quickly that if you have an exact and a detailed strategic plan and you've spent hours and days and weeks and months fine tuning this plan, there's like a 50-50 chance you're going to have to throw it out because some innovation will come in and disrupt everything and it's like game over. So I want to share that with you because when we get into strategic planning, you you are you're trying to balance the idea that whatever your strategy is, you kind of need to know when do you cut loose and stop following it. Okay. And I wish I had a good answer for that. That's why you want managers that have 20 or 30 years of experience in an industry leading the organization, is because they will have a better idea of when it becomes absurd to continue to follow the strategy, because after many things have changed. So, again, I don't have a specific great answer. Maybe I'll try to find a better answer, but for now, it's usually just knowledge of the industry would give you the indication of when you should cut your strategy and then follow a different one. Okay, back to this. So again, agents, executives often are not real thrilled with strategic planning. Now that's funny because if you talk to many a manager, they're like, "Oh, I love strategic planning." Well, you love it until you spend hours and hours doing it, and the next day you have to throw it out because ChatGPT just got invented, and that basically removed 30% of your workforce or what have you. So uh, just be aware of that. Another name I was telling you about was Henry Mintzberg. Uh, he was one of the first ones to find that managers really do not like to do strategic planning because of that. Small businesses, startup companies will get into product life cycles and company life cycles. Startup businesses also don't like to do strategic planning. And let's just go there now. So let's get into the life cycle. Yeah, well, that does get us into the first one. Yep, awesome, perfect. We're there. Okay, so when a company begins to launch and get ready to go set out to do this, there's a lot of common themes that happen at most startups. For example, usually within the first, I don't know, 6 months or a year, most startup companies are burning through cash at an obscene rate. They haven't sold enough product yet to actually figure out if this is viable. If you were to go to somewhere like Silicon Valley, there's a vernacular verbiage that's used for startups where they do what is it, round two, round three of fundraising to try to get enough money in to keep operating for then the next round of investment. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to find that time when they can sell enough to break even and or even a little more, and then they know, okay, maybe we actually do have something here. So later on we'll get into aligning the financials and aligning the type of investor you want to do that. We'll ignore that for the moment. So when most companies launch and they start up, they're trying to get to this growth phase of business here. At that growth phase of business, somewhere in there, they usually want to try to take it public. So, what they would do is they've maybe ran for, let's use Facebook. Facebook for a number of years before they went public, which means offer stock on the New York Stock Exchange in an initial public offering. They were trying to make sure that this was viable and they were trying to find a profit formula or a business formula that would work for them. Once they have that figured out, then they can do something called scaling it. Once they can scale it, at that point in time, that's when you want to uh, usually take the company public, which is when you want to launch. Or excuse me, not launch. That's when you want to contact an investment bank like Goldman Sachs and see what are their options. The just give me one. Yeah, let's just go there now. If I stop from time to time and I'm jumping around, it's because I'm at home and I have kids and cats and all sorts of stuff that are distracting me. Okay, let's go back just for a sec. Okay, so you need to know a product or organizational life cycle. You have a launch phase, a growth phase, a mature phase, and a decline phase. Couple things to remember. Number one, all companies go through these life cycles. Now, a lot of companies try to prevent the decline phase of business. When I used to teach in an MBA program, I would get students that would ask, well, shouldn't a good company never be in the decline phase of business? And the answer is yes, correct. In a perfect world, it shouldn't be in the decline phase of business. However, the reality is there, unless you're changing and adapting and you get really good at it, there's a strong chance you're going to go down. Okay, your business is going to decline at some point. But yes, in a perfect world, they wouldn't. So let's talk about that real quick. My wife has worked at 3M, which is now in Brookings called Solventum. They spun off due to a earplug lawsuit, which I won't talk about. But they spun off, and how they operate is 3M's we'll just call it 3M, is a conglomerate. It has many different business lines, many different manufacturing sectors. So it will make scotch tape and duct tape, and it will also make medical tape. Now, the manufacturing of those tapes may not be in the same plant or even on the same continent for that matter. It might be at different locations, but there's usually an underlying core competency that they're good at. So their core competency is usually thought of as innovation. So my wife makes an ampule, it's called a bio indicator, a BI, biological indicator. Let's go ahead and jump out here and have a little fun because why not? We'll show you what that looks like. Got it. Okay. So she helps manufacture, works on a product line, this thing called a biological indicator. So this little ampule gets thrown into an autoclave. An autoclave is it's like an oven to clean surgical tools. Um, they also have these that can go into medical furnaces that are trying to kill bacteria. And this I always think this biological indicator is so interesting. So some scientist was harvesting stuff from the bottom of the ocean, and one was next to one of those vents where you have the boiling water and uh, shooting up from the bottoms of the ocean. And a scientist figured out that there's actually uh, bacteria growing right next to these vents. Well, this is boiling water. It's almost up to, I don't know, 210 degrees or something. So they figured out it's like, wow, how can a bacteria survive that high of a temp? Most of the bacteria, as we know, die by at 150 degrees or whatever it is. So they harvested this and then they grow it literally in a plant and they coat the bacteria on a piece of paper. And when this bacteria dies, it exudes a chemical of some sort, which turns the inside of this indicator red or green or some color, telling you that all of the bacteria that was in this ampule has now died. So they, in theory, you throw this in an autoclave, and as long as this biological indicator turns green or whatever color it's supposed to turn, it tells you everything in there theoretically should be dead. Um, if it doesn't turn a certain color, then that means you need to run another cycle on the autoclave. So fundamentally, that's the idea. Now, every year, two, three, somewhere in there, my wife gets ready and the company gets ready to launch a new and improved product. We see this in software. You have 2.0 versions, 4.0, so on and so forth. And these are new and improved versions, even though a lot of times they're not, let's be honest, but they're new and improved versions, and it's kind of an idea of planned obsolescence. You're trying to come up with something that improves upon what you had. So this way, you continue to sell to usually the same customers a new and improved product. And it's in the Ansoff matrix, we'll talk about how you're trying to sell new products to the same customers, or you're trying to sell a new product, or excuse me, the same product you do to a new set of customers. Let's not go there right now. So every 2 or 3 years, they have a product life cycle and they launch a new product. So they invented this thing, they launched it, kind of worked, kind of didn't. Then all of a sudden it takes off, and the FDA says, nope, every autoclave has to have one of these biological indicators in it. So then it takes off. Every hospital has to buy these, and now they're using it. Now they get to the point of maturity where they're selling 300 million units of this to all the hospitals in the United States or the world or what have you. Now, the idea is once that product line hits a level of maturity, okay, so and here's the maturity phase. Once it hits that maturity phase, in a perfect world, that's when you get ready to launch a 2.0 version. Okay, so you launch this new version once the previous product hits maturity. Then, as it's growing, all of a sudden, you've launched it, it now starts growing and growing. Now your previous product starts declining, okay, and it's eventually it's going to go away. It's going to become obsolete. So then you launch us, you get to it. Oh, now this new and improved product hits maturity. So what do? You launch a 4.0 version of this. So most manufacturing companies, most software businesses have this planned obsolescence. Most technology companies. If you ever wonder, I watched a Joe Rogan episode and he was talking about how 8, 10 years ago, they're talking about the best smartphones you could buy. There's your phone at that time, especially, functioned absolutely fine. Electronics they were fast enough and processors were fast enough. There was nothing that you couldn't almost do on your phone. So it's like, well, why would you ever have to buy a new one? And the answer is because planned obsolescence. At some point, you run an update and this thing doesn't work anymore. So now you got to go buy a new one, even though your old phone was perfectly functional. But that's done on purpose. So we have these launch phases of business. And again, it looks like this. We launch for the introduction phase. You go into a growth phase. Again, somewhere in here, if you're talking a publicly traded company, usually somewhere in here, you want to go ahead and contact Goldman Sachs and say, hey, we need $100 million more to scale this up to maximize, to get everybody in the United States one of our widgets. You do that, and then we'll get to that later on. That gets into a whole other financial constraints that you need to be aware of. But that's how it looks. Now, with this information, here's where the cool thing happens. Financially speaking, you have constraints, and I teach much more of finance in my business courses because I used to teach finance. And the reason I do this is because there's constraints that most people do not understand. And if you don't understand those financial constraints and considerations, then if you read the Wall Street Journal, you wonder why is company A doing what they're doing? Well, it usually has something to do with their stock. Um, for one reason or another, their stock's going down and their profits might be going up, but their stock's going down. Well, what's going on with that? And once you understand the system of it all and how it interplays together, then things start making sense. Then you can start reading the Wall Street Journal and you can predict more or less what's going to happen next because you're pairing together business strategy and financial strategy. We're not there yet. Okay, but when we look at product life cycles, you can start forecasting expected cash flows, revenues, net income based on those product life cycles. I had a grad student many years ago who was a upper level manager at Poet, and they had a number of new products they were trying to develop, and one of his jobs was to figure out how much income, or excuse me, the financials of this new product line. Okay. And the new product line, in their case, was very novel at the time. It wasn't something no one in the science community and the ethanol community had ever thought to produce an ethanol off of some of the stuff that they were attempting to do. So the question is, well, is that of value? And the answer is, well, we don't know. Well, then how do we plan for something we don't know? And the answer is we go and grab, well, what happened when we tried to do this with corn? So they would have all of their financial information when they originally did this with corn and how they made ethanol with it. And they would model that same information on a cycle using something else other than corn to make alcohol. So they would overlay the two, and that's how they would estimate how much of a certain chemical they would have to buy to produce this, how much grease they would have to purchase to make sure the machinery was working. And they would forecast it based on previous inputs that they recorded from these other product lines. So again, based on this, we can start forecasting. It's not perfect by any sense of the imagination, but it's better than nothing. So these product life cycles are very important, how they work, what it tells us at the different levels. And this gets us into something called a Boston Consulting Group matrix. We're going to fly up and down here a little bit. I got to see where the BCG is. So Boston Consulting Group is one of three or four different very, very well-known business consulting firms. These business consulting firms usually hire their consultants directly from the Ivy League business schools, Harvard, so on and so forth. And Boston Consulting Group is one of those. And actually, the founders of these companies usually were professors at Harvard that were, for one reason or another, fired or kicked out or angry or disgruntled or something like that. And it's kind of the opposite of what you think um, with those that can't do teach. It's those that can't teach, I guess, do. Okay, come on. Please tell me I didn't scroll past it. There we go. So Boston Consulting Group created sort of a framework to for companies to help them plan. And they did so based on two dimensions. The first one was market growth rate, and the other dimension was relative market share. Okay, how much share does these product lines have? And they would classify each product line, usually in a business or a conglomerate, in each one of these categories. So the first one they would have is the star. The star would be a product that had high growth potential left and that had a fairly high market share. Okay, so it oh, I can't think of the term, saturated the market. So those product lines would be called stars. The next one is question marks. Now, the question marks would have a high expected growth rate, but so far don't have a lot of market share. Okay, so those would be those product lines that would be the case would be called question marks. Then you go over here to cows or cash cows, and that's kind of the idea where the term comes, or I won't say that's where it comes from. A cash cow is the cow that makes all the money, basically, produces the most. So a cash cow usually has not real high growth potential, but has totally taken over the market share. Okay. And we'll touch on that in a second. Those product lines are called cash cows because those are the ones that are making the company all the money. And that's where we get into financial strategy. So the last category is product lines that have low relative market share and they have low market growth potential. These are called dogs. And the idea is a company that has dogs, they're told to ditch their dogs. You want to get rid of those product lines that are not performing because they don't have any expected growth rate either. Now, there's a couple of circumstances where a company may not want to get rid of their dog because maybe it's a complement to another product line that happens to be a cash cow. And if they stop making this product line that is a complement to the other product that's being produced, the cash cow product, if they get rid of it, they may lose customers because of that. So to make the customers happy, you might not ditch your dogs. But for the most part, you would want to ditch your dogs as a general rule. That kind of gets us into finance. So we have our cash cows. Um, our cash cows, when we look at our life cycle, okay, and this is an overlay of the Boston Consulting Group and the growth cycle, you see when a product line is first launched or introduced, it's a question mark. It could have a high level of market share or, excuse me, growth potential. It might be able to, obtain a high level of market share. There's just so many unknowns. We don't know at this time. We don't know what the option is. The stars are those that have high expected growth rates, but low expected market, or excuse me, high expected growth and high expected market share. Okay. Those then could, if you imagine, could overlay on a growth phase of business or growth phase for the product line. Then once you hit maturity, that's where you have the cash cow. The company at that time knows how to make this product line. They've been doing it for a long time. Okay. It's that knowledge that's important. Okay. So the cash cow is the product that the company knows how to manufacture very, very well. They've been doing it forever. They've worked out all the kinks. They know how to do it cheaper than others do, so on and so forth. So the cash cow, usually you see it in a mature phase of business, not expected to grow very much anymore, but it's what's bringing home the bacon for the company. And then you have the decline, which a dog may or may not be in the decline phase of business. But when I saw this diagram, I couldn't help but copy and paste it because I thought it was it's an interesting way to look at the Boston Consulting Group and overlay it onto a product life cycle. So again, knowing where this is at in the expected cash flows and financials tells you how you get the financing to operate the company. Because remember, if we use like Poet doesn't just, I shouldn't say that. I don't think they do just one thing. Let's use 3M. 3M doesn't do one thing, it does 592 different things or manufactures 592 different items. So when a conglomerate's trying to manage that portfolio of product lines, they're they're trying to figure out what is the best source of capital to be used for each one of these. So when you're in the introduction phase and you don't know what's going to happen, you don't want to be borrowing money from First Bank and Trust to finance that. Now, I know a lot of you have heard in entrepreneurship that it's very common for entrepreneurs to go borrow money from the bank. I'm here to tell you, no, not necessarily. Banks will loan you money if you're buying land, equipment, or hard assets that they know have a market value. Banks do not want to lend to a company that doesn't have evidence that they can produce whatever it is they're producing. So, in other words, the bank will borrow the money to a company provided it has evidence of being able to turn a profit. If they don't have that, well, the bank's not going to want to loan money unless it's secured or collateralized because it's land, it's a hard asset, it's equipment, it's something that has tangible value that if you default on it, the bank can go sell that and get their money back. Okay, so those are all pieces of information and knowledge that as a running a business, you're trying to balance this and manage this to maximize your position. How cool is that, right? Okay, so before we get there, well, as we get there, we'll get into the Ansoff matrix next. I wanted to talk a little bit about a product or a life cycle that I found that I thought was so cool because it explains something that, well, it helped me try to explain something. Uh, when I was doing some consulting work with my church, actually, we were talking about this, and I'll trying to think how much of that to share. If you've taken Management 360, you've probably heard this story, but I want to share it with you because it's very important to understand, again, the alignment of strategy and financials and growth and trying to figure out how to do all those things. I am going to stop just for a moment, though, to grab a drink. And we're back. Okay. So while I was working with my church, I was researching other churches in the general community that were growing, and I found one church that was growing. It was a mega church, or turned into a mega church 15 years ago. It was very similar to the church I attend. And I was researching it because I'm asking the question, what changes need to be made? And as I'm trying to communicate with these older folks there about, well, here's what we need to do, I realized how uncomfortable they were getting because what they did not want to take the option of contemporizing our worship service and modernizing and doing all these things because the reason they go to the church they go to is because they like its traditional feel. However, they have to also understand that, well, if you don't modernize here, you're not going to be around for much longer. Uh, and that's true of most businesses and most organizations, is they have to grow, which we'll talk later about the presupposition that companies have to grow. They don't have a choice. Even nonprofits very often have to grow because they don't have a choice. So I found this diagram and I thought it was so interesting because it gave a narrative to what I was trying to explain to these older folks in regards to this life cycle and how this is based on knowledge and information, and it communicated it quite succinctly. So with my church, the church I go to is filled with the most left-brained people you would meet on planet Earth. My church operates like a Swiss watch. It's insane. We have a business administrator that has the best financial reporting, the best meeting minutes, that organizationally you just don't. I've never seen an organization ran tighter than that ship, in large part because of this business administrator. So the people that are attracted to that are usually left brain people. We've got a number of deans, we've got CEOs, business executives that go to this church, in part because I'm sure there's this left wing function or left brained function, not left wing. Um, so when you talk to these left brain folks, okay, real quick, left brain is it we, which this isn't correct, but it's old school way of explaining the world. You have people that have a left brain function, which is very administrative. They're planners, they're detail oriented, that type of thing. And then you have right brain function, so to speak, that is much more creative, and we don't worry about plans, and we just kind of make things happen, and we'll see what happens. So we have a dominant left brained, and our leadership is very left brained. Again, tightest meeting minute notes I've ever read in my life. So when I'm trying to communicate with them and they say, well, so we got to change. So we got to do it. We have to do a new strategic plan. And again, this is an organization that I've been involved with five strategic plans there. And I'm realizing when we're going through these plans, I'm like, this isn't going to get you out of the mess you're in. Then I thought, well, how do you talk about that? How do you communicate? Well, where do you go then? And the answer is, well, we don't know. If you don't want to copy and take the route of the other church that has figured out success, or there's evident of success, if you don't want to copy that, well, what are you going to do that you think's going to grow? And what gives you the why do you think that's you're going to grow? If there's no evidence for it, your guess is no better than, some guy off the street. So it's well, then what do you do? And I'm having these conversations with these folks, and they keep going back to Bruce, we need to do strategic planning. And I look at them and I say, guys, I teach strategic planning, and I will tell you that is going to dig you in a deeper hole if you do strategic planning. I promise you it's going to dig you into a deeper hole and it's going to waste your time because a strategic plan requires some strategy. It requires a pattern of movement. It If you haven't found a good way to do this, then what are you gonna plan? You haven't figured out the big question yet. So when we talk about strategy formulation, in business, it's usually because you learned how to produce something or do something that others couldn't do. You found a sustainable competitive advantage, and now you're trying to scale it. Okay, and scale can be thought of as broad in that term. So if you don't have that though, then you don't have anything. Then you're kind of, grabbing around in the dark trying to feel your way and figure out, well, what do we want to do here? So my church, I'm trying to tell them if you don't want to do what this other church does, then why, like, you want to come up with a vision, where do you want to go? But you have absolutely no evidence that heading in that path is going to be sustainable. You're just as likely, in fact, way more likely, you're going to pick the wrong thing, and then you're going to be committed to that wrong thing, and you will be in the decline phase to a point. Okay, if you imagine, sorry, I know I have my little, well, here we're in this decline phase over here. So you imagine here's your launch, here's your growth, here's your mature, and here's your decline. We're probably right here. At some point, we've shrank by about 50% over the last 12 years. At some point, we're not going to be sustainable because it takes about 50 to 100 people to financially sustain a church. Okay. So we're probably going to be short on that in the next 5 to 10 years. But then the question is, well, what do we do? And again, I have a bunch of left brain types that, well, let's make a strategic plan. It's like, no, 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 no. You're not getting it. You're wasting your time because you don't know a pathway forward. Strategic planning is to identify the pattern and scale it. You don't have any of those things. So trying to communicate this stuff, I'm like, what am I trying to tell these people in effect? And then I found this diagram. So again, if you imagine the overlay of here's your launch, and this diagram calls it entrepreneurial action. And there's a reason they call it that is because that's the same thing as the launch phase. Then, once you get up here into the growth phase somewhere, now you've figured out how to do something that you couldn't do before, that you discovered a way of operating that can be successful. Maybe you found a specific clientele, maybe you did something with the product that makes it more viable. Whatever that is, now you can plan to scale it. If you have not found that, though, then you haven't found anything. You're still down here. You're trying to discover whatever that might be. So, when you have a company, and this is true for companies as well as churches or any other organization, is you strategic plan once you've discovered whatever that pattern is. Then you mature, like all, we die, and then a lot of times companies will go into crisis mode because they're shrinking, they don't know what else to do. A big one that happened here in the last 15 years was J.C. Penney's. They started losing clientele, they didn't know what to do, and they started changing a bunch of stuff. They got rid of their coupons. They used to have buy one, get one free, or 50% off, and they had the same stupid discount every week. They would just shift which one was buy one, get one free versus 50%, but it was the same, whatever. So they brought in all these CEOs to try to change things, and nothing ever got changed. Or nothing ever worked, I should say, when they tried to do that. So they kept firing CEOs to bring other people in. So this entire time they're going through CEOs, they're kind of in this entrepreneurial space. Okay, so when J.C. Penney's hits crisis or when my church hits crisis, well, now we got to figure out a pathway forward. But nobody knows that. If somebody knew it, they would have already done it and knew it would work, and they'd copy it and they'd, okay, let's do this. So as you're going through that, what's required is transformational leadership. And that is the uncomfortable, that's no other way to describe it. That is the uncomfortable process of trying to figure out, well, now what do we do? Because we can't keep doing what we're doing. So we have to search and discover what that is. And oftentimes, if a company can transform, that's what's required. It's not we need to come up with a new product line. It's not like, well, if we only do this, like J.C. Penney's, if we only, what their idea was to end their buy one get one free and their 50% off discounts and just put a marked price that was way less than it had been before. Um, well, the customers didn't like that and said, no, give us our discounts back. So they fired that CEO. They brought in the old CEO, and nope, that didn't work. So they have to transform into something different than what they are today. And that is uncomfortable, horribly uncomfortable. People are not sure what to do. You're not sure if anything's going to work, and people are nervous, and employees are nervous. And then you start seeing maybe another company or somebody else that figures out, like, well, if you do this, if you transform in this way, then you might have an option to do A, B, or C versus, X, Y, and Z. Maybe that's where we should go. So you start exploring and figuring out, well, we still have customers. We still got to figure out what to do. My church still has people there. So we need to transform, which, by the way, is a way different leader than a strategic manager. A transformational leader is very creative. They're right-brained. A strategic manager is very left-brained. You don't want the left-brained person trying to be in charge when transformation is needed, because they will do the opposite of transformation. So you go in this process, you start coming up with ideas. Maybe you pick two or three and say, you know what, let's try these two or three and let's experiment. Let's figure out if it works. And then you get into the entrepreneurial action, and maybe one or two really does work. So maybe you decide, let's run with that and let's see how far we can go with it. Maybe it works a little better. Now you're looking at it and saying, well, maybe we can scale this. That's when you start doing the strategic management. And again, that's a different person very often. Startup companies, it's very common for them to hit a certain point and they say, we need to bring in new leadership because the innovators, the founders of the company don't know how to scale up to the next level. And if they are the creative type, they're the transformational type, that's not the same thing as a left brain strategic manager. That's when you bring in somebody else that enjoys doing those types of things as well. Not only that, or they're wired to do it. Okay, you know what? I think we're gonna stop here. I wondered if I wasn't not gonna get through this. We're gonna stop off at the Ansoff matrix and go through that in the next video. Wish we had gotten farther, but my voice is starting to give out, so it's time to hit pause. Hope you have a great rest of your day. There's nothing else on the blotter unless I've emailed it to you, and this is not, if you're in 2027 or 2028 or something and you're listening to this, uh, this was recorded in 2025. So uh, all of this is still probably the same, but any assignments or anything else, you want to make sure you're monitoring your email or your D2L communication. Have a good rest of your day, night, or whatever. We'll catch you later.